Hello, I'm Walter Haug, and welcome to the CPG Xchange podcast, where we discuss current issues in revenue growth management, data analytics, category management, and more. I'm the owner of the Data Science and Strategy Share Group and the Revenue Growth Management Share Group. Today, we're focusing on the topic that's plagued CPG for the last couple of years, inflation. And with an expert in that field, Ray Florio of Circana, he'll introduce himself in just a minute. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Jan Van Hook. Jan, welcome. Hi, how are things in sunny South Florida?
Things are great, warm as always, Walter. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CPG Exchange. As Walter said, my name is Jan Van Hook at Tata Consultancy Services. Just a quick overview of TCS. We partner with over 100 CPG and retail brands across the globe, including the likes of Nestle, Unilever, P&G, C&S Wholesale, and many others to accelerate the growth of digital transformation journeys. So with that brief introduction out of the way, Ray, my friend, welcome to the CPG Exchange. And can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me, especially on a subject that about which I may have some strong feelings. But to introduce myself, my name is Ray Florio. I serve as managing partner of the growth consulting group for Circana. And after being in the consulting space for about 20 years now, I focused entirely on strategy and profitability for some of the largest companies that span everything from high tech to oil and gas to financial services, even to federal agencies, if you can imagine that, and everything in between. The past decade, during which I've been at Circana, I've been focused almost exclusively on consumer goods and services. Now, Circana itself, everyone knows it as the market research firm previously known as the combined entity of IRI and NPD. They cover all forms of consumer goods and services. Now, our consulting practice within there is a boutique strategy house, and we pride ourselves on delivering guidance that accounts for the intricacies and the nuances of our client's business. What that means is that if we're helping a meat packer, we'd account for things like carcass utilization. Or if we help a consumer electronics company, we'd address gray market concerns. In the end, that means that we can deliver strategic recommendations that require far less translation to put into practice to drive top and bottom line growth sustainably for our clients.
It's a great evolution that IRI, NPD, and Circana have had, Ray, and thank you for that. And welcome to the show. We're going to get a quick question in, though, about your paternity leave, which I know you're coming off of, and thank you for spending some time with us today. You had a recent addition to your family. Before we get into inflation, what's it been like to be out on paternity leave for the last 5 or 6 weeks? And, what's it meant to you to be able to do that and spend that time with your family?
Thank you for asking about that. It's something I'm particularly grateful for because for my wife and I, this is actually our fourth child. I'll let that sink in for just a moment there. But we already had 6-year-old and 4-year-old boys and a 2-year-old daughter before this. So even with additional help, I have to be there for my 2 older boys and my daughter because in addition to getting to know my new son, I had some pretty specific tasks over the course of my leave as my wife recovered. And giving you a sense of that, my 6-year-old is very heavily involved in hockey. So for him, I guess you can call it chauffeur plus trainer plus the guy who helps put his uniform and equipment on all during the week and during the weekends, traveling to nearby states for tournaments and games. During the week, it's for practices. But it's all to make sure that his life still feels pretty normal during this time. And then turning to my other 2 children, when you think about my daughter, she's 2. Now she's ready to move out of the nursery so that this way it's free and open so that when our youngest moves out of the bassinet. But what we normally do is each child goes through a transition room, neutral gray furniture, because they're 2, they don't know what they like yet. But My 4-year-old was ready to move out of that into his own room. So my big task during these 6 weeks was to design, put together, and decorate an entire pirate-themed bedroom for him. So he's in a bed that looks like a big ship with a mast and sails on it and everything like that. But it just, in general, means that I was there to have a part when I was really needed. So that I was particularly happy about.
Is it more challenging to do a pirate themed room than to forecast inflation?
In some ways it is. It's a very different skill set, but at least I had experience with my oldest. I had to do for him an entire race car themed room and everything like that 2 years ago. So there's a
Not
little
your
more.
first rodeo.
Yeah.
All right, good. Well, thank you for that Ray. We're glad you had that opportunity. But obviously, the topic of inflation hasn't stood still while you've been out. It's been a big topic in every household in the country, and for CPG manufacturers, especially the people that are in revenue growth management, it's been at times an all-consuming topic. And we had
Yes.
the chance to hear you talk about it and forecast a little bit in 2023. What 2023 was going to be all about this time last year. How have things panned out versus what you were projecting this time last year? And what, if anything, has surprised you?
So you mentioned we've spoken about this a few times in the past, but I think the biggest change right now that I'm seeing is I always felt when I was giving my input that I was comparatively pessimistic compared to everyone else. But I'm actually seeing the Federal Reserve start to give a dimmer forecast than I ever did. If you remember back last year, I said inflation may abate a bit, but it's not going away anytime soon. 2024 would be the earliest we truly see a recovery. Now, that's making me sound like a bright ray of sunshine when you see that the Fed gave an expectation recently that was closer to 2026 when it believes it can finally return inflation to a desired level. Now, what has surprised me, truthfully, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but there's been sentiment from everyday Americans on just how bad the economy feels to them. I don't know if you've seen how bad it's gotten, but people are actually putting up posts online that are glamorizing the circumstances during the Great Depression. Now, there's even been the trend of people saying the current environment is worse than that. They're terming it a silent depression, so that in spite of the top line indicators, things are worse than they appear, but it's hidden beneath the statistics. Now, whether you're capturing that in official figures on consumer confidence or not, it's not a good sign. Let's put it that way. But I want to also give you a more popular example of how that's playing out. If you look at what some are stating, and I'll wax a little poetic here to fit with what they're saying, is during those bygone golden days of the late 30s, some have even said that adjusted for inflation, the average worker was bringing home $85,000 a year in today's dollars. Sounds a little bit extreme, doesn't it?
It
And,
does.
well, it is because it's not true. It's based on only a small handful of tax returns and high earners in one geographic area. But there's a small kernel of truth in the overall sentiment, and I know I'm going to have to unpack that statement there. And Walter, you've seen my historical comparisons by now, so I'm going to give you one for today's recording as well. I'm actually going to look at if we compare household finances during the Depression, pre-pandemic, and today. They actually set up a pretty interesting parallel because back during the 30s, typical American household, if you adjust for inflation, they brought in an income of $38,000. That's the real number, not 85,000. Now, after taxes, you paid only about $1,500 in taxes on that, and then your household expenditures were about $31,500. If you're doing the math, you're ahead at about $5,000 a year left over that you could save or invest. Okay, doesn't sound too bad when you think about it on a percentage basis. But let's also think about just prior to the pandemic, 2019, 2020. Things were obviously looking brighter than the Great Depression, let's put it that way. But household incomes, if you once again adjust them for today's dollars, they're about $96,000. That's a lot better. But think about it this way, you have to make more today because back during the 30s, there are many homes that didn't have things like electricity or indoor plumbing or heat, for instance. So costs have gone up for now. Tax rates are also significantly higher than they were back then. So out of that 96,000, 21,000 goes to taxes. You're living at that better standard, costs are more, expenditures are now 68,000. Once again, do the math, 2019, 2020, you're coming back with $7,000 at the end of the year to save or invest. And you know what? You're living a longer life, you have more to put into your retirement fund so that you could enjoy it. Now let's think today. If you crunch the numbers today, first off, real wages are actually down because there was downsizing during COVID. You had the inflation occurring. It's no longer $96,000 as it was prior to the pandemic. Now it's about $87,000. Taxes also went down. They're about 19,000. But inflation has actually increased household expenditures from 68,000 to 70. So 87,000 minus 19,000 minus 70,000. That math doesn't work. You're actually in the red $2,000. That is worse than the depression in some cases. And I hope that snapshot doesn't cause depression amongst the listeners, though.
Well, they say that's the saying today that math ain't mathin', right? And maybe that math is mathing if you think from the standpoint of the consumer, where you can have an economy up 4.9% in the third quarter, kind of surprising, right? And the Fed chairman still kind of saying, "Hey, we're not done yet," right? But you can also see that consumer is stressed, and why CPG companies are worried and looking at how are they going to combat this thing. They live it, right, every day. So can you share maybe a little bit about what the best in class companies are doing or have done in this this past year to 18 months to sort of stay ahead of the wave and keep their business going and while serving their consumers?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is the current environment does actually present some opportunities for the some more sophisticated companies. And that's particularly in the case of CPG. Because if you think about the decision process for saving money, CPG really is a bit different. Unlike other areas of the economy, you can't really do without basics like food, personal care products, and the like, because let's be honest, people like to live. They can't just go without food, for instance. Well, rather than cut the items out, if you're making a change as a shopper, you're switching to a different, cheaper version. Now, that could be in buying it at a different location, buying it in a different pack configuration, or the product type itself. So instead of buying prime cuts of steak, I'm going to buy choice. Instead of buying chicken breasts, I'm going to buy thighs. Or you can even change up the brand itself. Now, if you're a manufacturer in this environment, your overarching goal is twofold: minimize the opportunity for cost conscious shoppers to make that decision to decide between alternatives, but also strengthen your own leverage in that decision process. And since you asked for examples, I'll give you what I feel was really a best in class one. And this was a premium brand of personal care products. Now, when I say premium, I'm also talking about an extreme here. Imagine a price 3 times that of the competition for 3 times less product. Now, if you're today's price sensitive shopper, that's kind of a red zone to be in. Now, at the same time, the brand relied very heavily on the heritage of its brand. It didn't really articulate the true benefits that it provided. On top of that, they needed a price increase to maintain margins in the face of inflation. Not really sounding like a good time to be them, does it?
No.
Now, we did some work with them, and we identified that they had a small core of extremely loyal shoppers who knew there was a functional benefit to their products. But that wasn't really widely perceived by the market. What we did were the two things that I had described. Limit the number of times shoppers could make a comparison by first introducing larger double packs so that they're shopping less frequently and seeing the comparison less frequently. But also, we strengthened the leverage by actively emphasizing what the functional benefits are. In this case, it was treating the cause, the root cause of the condition that it achieved instead of just the symptoms. Now, you made those changes and you put through the necessary price increase, and volume actually went up to about 25% with a larger consumer footprint despite that higher price tag. This is good news. This is actually something that is repeatable because during time that's economically stressful, shoppers don't really look to just purely cut spending. They look to drive more value from the dollars they spend. And it's uncovering what drives that value that's really going to keep you in the game. And frankly, may give you an opportunity to take more share than you've ever had before.
A great example, right? Thank you. I'm sure everyone would want to be having that kind of success story.
I certainly would.
So Ray, we've heard you talk about inflation in the past and the tough job that the Federal Reserve is doing trying to tamp down inflation while at the same time avoid a recession. So in some ways, it seems that your predictions that you made for the year are in fact coming true, which is fantastic, right? Interest rates are rising. The inflation rate is starting to slow, yet the economy continues to grow and the job market remains strong. So what do you see the Fed doing now over the next 12 months in order to continue to tamp down on inflation?
Sure. So Walter alluded to the idea that the Fed was actually saying, hold on, third quarter, don't get too excited. And I think that's worth exploring a little bit because that's going to dictate some of what the Fed is going to do. So the question is, why is the economy growing actually right now? Now, it's a pretty consistent story and ties back into what I said earlier about Americans not being thrilled with the current state, finances going into the red, because that's what's driving the Q3 GDP gains right now. Because the parts of the GDP that grew, the biggest factors were consumer and residential spending. Now, normally, you would say, well, that's a great sign. Consumer confidence is up. People expect things to work out well, so they're spending money. They're willing to go out there and use their savings. Well, I don't know if that is the case. One, I mean, if you look into those factors, you'll actually find the average household savings have declined and debt has grown. But that gives me cause for concern right now. Because in one part, that growth means that the interest rates are not yet high enough to do their intended job. But in another, if you actually ask people why they're dipping in and why they're actually taking on more debt, it's unfortunately pretty dismal. The answer tends to be that they're afraid price inflation is going to continue. And if they don't buy what they need now, it'll cost substantially more to do so next year or the year after. There's nothing sustainable when that's the driver of growth, and it potentially indicates something extremely bad is on the way, worse than we've seen. Now, before I depress everyone once again, all that means is that the Fed has no choice but to continue raising rates. Now, especially because on top of the spending, you mentioned that the job markets remain strong. This actually is not a good thing when you're trying to combat inflation. Apart from odd times like during the oil crisis of the 70s, the concept of the Phillips curve is one that has proven itself out quite often. And for all the listeners out there, it's the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Essentially, it means that we need to raise rates enough to start raising unemployment in order to finally see inflation in our rearview mirrors. Now, let's make matters worse on top of that, as if that wasn't bad enough already. If you're also going after a soft landing, and I always say this when I speak, is that the Fed has never successfully achieved a soft landing in their history when they raise rates after inflation has manifested itself. They did so preemptively in the 90s, but never any other time aside from that. But that was also because they tried to stop inflation before it happened, which is what they should be doing. Now, the sad part is going after this soft landing is hamstringing yourself. On top of that, one thing we always forget is every time the Fed raises rates, our debt gets more expensive. This was fine when we did this in the early 80s when we raised interest rates up to 20%. But our debt is over 100 times higher than it was then, and we're issuing it at a far faster pace than we could have ever believed possible at that point. Given that, I think it's pretty clear that the Fed is going to continue to raise rates, but it's going to do so at a very gradual rate. And it may not prove sufficient to get us to the desired 2% inflation rate by the end of 2024. There may be more rate increases coming after the next 12 months as well. I know that's probably what many people wanted to hear, but it is how you have to read the situation if you look at all the underlying factors.
Yeah. So for all our listeners out there and the CPGs, especially that are trying to forecast where this stuff is going to go, what do you see for next year in terms of the inflation rate? And you kind of gave us a preview of the Fed. What should everybody be? What should the Ray Florio line in their data ingestion for their inflation models say?
Yeah, I knew you'd try to peg me down on the numbers.
I have to, got to do it.
Of course. So I think there are several estimates out there right now, and I'll go over a little bit of what the range looks like, and then I'll give you my thoughts. But everything's out there as low as 1.1% to 3.6%. But what's driving those differences? I mean, if you're forecasting 1.1%, you'd think it's a rosy picture that, hey, inflation's definitely under control, but it's also tied to the idea that the landing you achieve is anything but soft. If you're thinking 3.6%, you're seeing the Fed falling short in its actions completely. Now, you did ask my beliefs, and these are my own personal ones. I actually think a bit differently. I've said that the Fed's hands are a bit tied, but I like to go back to what are the most basic factors when I consider any forecast. Now, if you think that way, I'm more concerned about the household budgets I shared earlier. And when I said the average savings, the average household is in the red. More so than anything else, this is what's going to drive the future of the economy because it can't continue. Right now, the growth is literally people pulling purchases forward that would have happened in Q4 and Q1 and Q2. Now, unless there's a very sizable increase in real wages across the board very quickly, spending is going to need to decline. And that's regardless of what the Fed does. That's going to lead to higher unemployment, and that will finally bring inflation back down. Question is, how long is it going to take for that to play out? I don't see it happening all within 2024 right now. In all likelihood, I see inflation closer to 3% for the year, with it potentially getting back to normal in 2025. So yeah, once again, I'm somewhat more optimistic than the Fed in that prediction, but I'm not sure I'm more optimistic in the way that we get there this time.
So Ray, accurately predicting inflation is critical, a critical foundational element for any and all CPG companies for sure. However, the way that these companies cope with inflation is even more important. This year we've seen has been one where retailers are pushing back on manufacturer price increases. And now in many cases, we're seeing category volume decline. So with that lens on, what do you think that CPG companies should be doing in order to combat inflation in the future? And then specifically around emerging technologies like generative AI, how do you see that playing into the landscape?
I'm really glad you asked about that. And I'll start with the more basic before I go into the technology aspects of it. But I think right now we're at the point where the errors of the past few decades are catching up. And if you think about CPGs and revenue management teams, it feels like over the past several years, going back to the early 2000s even, The original design was purely around the prospect of calculating elasticity more accurately than the year before, and then using that as the driver of pricing decisions. This has been a fairly substantial problem in this past year and a half, especially. Now, when you think about a truly strategic RGM organization, you need to think a little more broadly. And that's because a very wide range of factors actually influence what you can charge. It's not about what your elasticity is, it's what's driving that elasticity. You need to be finding leverage in all of those potential areas that you can move into. That means instead of beginning with the question of what is my elasticity, begin with the question of what do I need the price to be in order to meet my financial image goals? Now, if you do that, you open the door to a much wider series of opportunities. You then can ask, hey, if I have the existing leverage to achieve that price with the elasticity, okay, but what if I don't? And if you don't, you need to be able to determine how to get there. Now, that includes elements like, does the channel distribution actually help my pricing leverage? Does the assortment that I have available give me the opportunity to charge the right price? Does the pack architecture work in the way that I need it to? Then getting into more longer term things like what's the messaging and positioning around it? The example I gave about the personal care products, the biggest unlock was messaging and positioning that enabled it to reduce the elasticity substantially. But then you go into also the product attributes and features itself, so that we're talking about how do you feed into the actual innovation pipeline. What are the things that should be in there, not that appeal to the shoppers, but that drive the willingness to pay among shoppers? And then when you know all of those things, you have the opportunity to figure out which of those or which combinations of those get you where you need to be in the most cost efficient manner, so that you're not only growing up, choose your own adventure of share, volume, or margin, but you can grow all three of those at the same time. But above all, and I have to stress this incredibly so after the past year, stop giving away equity with promotions that are less effective, either due to their design or the funding terms with the retailer. And we're at the point where those two things, the actual event parameters and the actual negotiation with the retailer, cannot live in a siloed environment. Those need to be brought together into one single view as well. And finally, I'll close off with your question on technology. I think there are significant efficiency gains that can be had in the basic blocking and tackling. Imagine, okay, how much time I could focus on some of those harder elements if I don't actually have to seek out opportunities that I can currently take price. I get them all alerted to me from the get-go. I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can use AI to actually indicate where do I have the existing opportunities, or where are there some risks that competitors have taken price and it's the most, let's say, the weakest area for me. It's my blind spot, or it's a competitor that's really trying to change the market that I can get pinpointed for me right and early without having to do the investigation myself. Now, I think those simple signals, when those basic blocking and tackling elements come up, should be something we can really minimize the time that we dedicate to it through more advanced technology. And much of this is available right now to make use of.
Great.
So all good counsel, Ray. And I think what you said earlier that ties into that for me resonates, is the RGM groups just have to keep going down that path of it being increasingly strategic, and while managing the present, right, and resisting those urges to go back to the bad promotional behaviors of the past that we all thought in the pandemic year were gone for good.
Yeah.
But looking ahead, I think, to put a wrap on this now, and thinking maybe about that, what you just said about, being more strategic with it, the groups have to look not just to 2024, but 25 and 26. And, can you just sort of put a bow on this by taking a little look into the future and saying, where might inflation go, and what should we be doing to get ready for 25 and 26?
I probably gave my view away on where inflation is going, but if
You
we're
did.
talking about getting ready for 25 and 26, I think the big thing is it's never too late to go into the more sophisticated RGM capabilities I described. Because the thing that's great about it is even if I'm horribly wrong on where the economy is going and where inflation is headed, let's say the economy just takes off like a rocket next week, inflation goes down to zero and maybe even negative, and things get back to where they were pre-pandemic. Never really happened before, but let's just take an extreme example. Well, if you've made an investment in more sophisticated RGM, it's still going to drive some of the most substantial returns of any that you could make, no matter what the economic cycle is. So there's nothing that can hurt you about doing this. It's an opportunity that's open for you. Look at the current environment as one that has been kind of an eye opener to the opportunity that's out there. Take advantage of it. Now, hopefully, a number of the RGM guys out there are going to love me for saying it that way and give credit that oftentimes they don't get for what they can achieve with the business.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end it, Ray. And I think you're right. And hopefully people will take that quote to their next meeting when they need a tool. They need some investment to get there. But on behalf of Jan and TCS, I'd really just like to thank you for being with us today, for coming on the podcast, and I want to thank all our listeners out there for being with us today, and encourage everyone to look for future episodes of the CPG Xchange podcast. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.